The wind over the Karelian Isthmus didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a high, thin sound that stripped the spirit bare and turned the moisture in a man's nostrils to needles of ice. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Volkov lay in a spider hole that had become his entire universe, a shallow depression carved into the iron-hard permafrost, lined with the frozen needles of pine boughs. This was the frozen siege of January 1940. To the Soviet High Command in Moscow, it was a frustrating delay on a map. To Mikhail, it was a test of whether a human being could turn into a stone and still retain the will to kill. Mikhail was a man of the Urals, a hunter who had tracked lynx through forests so thick the sun never touched the forest floor. But the Winter War was a different beast. He had arrived in December with the 7th Army, part of a massive steamroller intended to crush Finnish resistance in weeks. Instead, they had marched into a white nightmare. The temperatures had plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. The Red Army's olive-drab uniforms were dark scars against the pristine snow, making them easy targets for the Finnish Sisai, the ski troops who moved like ghosts. Mikhail had watched his platoon dwindle, not just from the terrifying White Death snipers, but from the cold that froze the oil in their rifles and the blood in their veins. He had survived by reverting to the primal. He traded his standard gear for a white camouflage smock he'd stripped from a fallen scout. He learned the sniper's secret language of the Arctic. Never breathe directly into the air, or the steam of your breath would hang like a silver flag, shouting your position to the enemy. Instead, he breathed through a thick wool scarf, his face encrusted with a mask of frost. By mid-January, the Soviet advance had stalled completely before the Mannerheim line. At a nameless crossroads near Hill 104, a Finnish marksman had become a legend of terror. The men called him the Icicle. He was so precise that he didn't just hit soldiers, he hit the buttons on their tunics. He had paralyzed a battalion, turning a vital supply route into a graveyard of stalled trucks and frozen corpses. Mikhail was ordered to eliminate him. It was a suicide mission masked as an order. For the first 24 hours, Mikhail did nothing but exist. He lay under a drift of snow, his Mosin Nagant 9130 pulled tight against his chest to keep the bolt from seizing. He lived on sugar cubes and snow, his stomach a knot of hunger that had long since gone numb. He watched the Finnish lines through his PE telescopic sight, a world of gray shadows and jagged granite. The Icicle was good, better than anyone Mikhail had ever hunted. The Finn never shot from the same spot twice. He used the cuckoo tactic, firing from the high branches of snow-laden pines, or from deep within the cracks of boulders. On the second night, the silence was broken by the rhythmic thud of Soviet artillery, a desperate attempt to soften the Finnish lines. Mikhail didn't blink. He knew the Finn would use the flashes of the shells to relocate. At dawn on the third day, a rare event occurred. The sun appeared. It was a pale, weak disk that sat low on the horizon, casting shadows that were miles long and distorted. Mikhail adjusted his position by a fraction of an inch, his frozen joints popping with a sound that felt like a gunshot in his own ears. He scanned a ridge of rocks 500 meters away. The light was hitting the granite at a sharp angle. Suddenly he saw it, a shimmer. It wasn't the glint of a lens. The Finns were too smart for that. It was a slight distortion in the rising heat haze of a man's body. Even at 40 below, a human body emits enough warmth to create a tiny shimmer in the crystalline air. Then a branch moved. Not because of the wind had died down to a whisper, but because something had brushed against it. Mikhail felt his heartbeat slow. This was the hunter's trance. He wrapped his finger around the trigger, feeling the 2 stages of resistance. He didn't aim at the shadow. He aimed at where the man's chest would be if he were leaning against the rock. The Mosin Nagant roared, a violent intrusion into the silence. The recoil kicked into Mikhail's shoulder, a dull ache through layers of wool and canvas. Through the scope, he saw a flurry of white powder. A shape tumbled from behind the rock, sliding down the embankment like a broken doll before coming to rest in a drift. Mikhail didn't move for another 6 hours. He waited to see if a partner would emerge. He waited to see if he had been spotted. Only when the purple shadows of twilight returned did he allow himself to crawl backward, out of his hole and into the safety of the Soviet trenches. Winning the duel didn't end the war. The frozen siege dragged into February, and the atmosphere turned from tactical to psychological. The Red Army was suffering from trench madness. The Finnish tactic of Modi, encircling Soviet columns and cutting them into isolated islands, meant that Mikhail often spent his nights listening to the distant, frantic gunfire of trapped units that he could not reach. He saw the human timber waves. Thousands of young men from the sun-drenched plains of Ukraine and the Caucasus were sent running across frozen lakes in broad daylight. The Finnish Maxims mowed them down in rows. Mikhail's job shifted from hunting snipers to providing overwatch, a polite term for picking off Finnish machine gunners to give his countrymen a few more seconds of life. He grew to hate the silence most of all. In the silence, he remembered the smell of wood smoke in his village. He remembered the taste of fresh bread. In the silence, the cold felt like a physical weight, pressing on his skull, trying to force his eyes to close for a short nap, from which he knew he would never wake. By March, the sheer, brutal arithmetic of the Soviet Union began to prevail. More tanks, more shells, and more men were poured into the meat grinder. The Mannerheim line finally buckled. On the day the ceasefire was announced, Mikhail was positioned in a ruined farmhouse near the border. When the word came down the line that the war was over, he didn't feel relief. He felt a strange, hollow vacuum. He climbed out of the rubble, his movements stiff and jerky, like an old man's. He looked across the clearing toward the Finnish lines. For the first time, he saw them without the lens of his scope. They were climbing out of their holes, men in white rags, looking like ghosts rising from the earth. One Finn, a man who looked no older than 20, stopped and looked directly at Mikhail. They stood 300 meters apart, the distance of a standard kill shot. The Finn didn't raise his rifle. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement between two survivors of a hell that the men back in Moscow could never understand. Mikhail Volkov returned to the Soviet Union with a medal and a rank, but he left his spirit in the Karelian snow. He spent the rest of his life in the mountains, but he could never again hunt. The sound of a rifle shot, once the sound of his livelihood, now sounded like the cracking of the ice on the day the frozen siege finally broke. The Winter War was a conflict of maps and borders, but for the snipers in the drifts, it was a war of seconds, breath, and the terrible, beautiful endurance of the human heart in the face of absolute zero.